Okay, let's say welcome to the Guest Safety Officer Lobby Group. And this week we've got Mike Kill back. But before we get started with Mike Kill, just going to introduce ourselves. So, Ian, would you like to introduce yourself this week?
Yeah, my name's Ian Fox. I am one of the founders of the Guest Safety Officer Lobby Group. And of course, I am a generalist. A strategic risk and management consultant is how I would consider and describe myself these days. So basically, I know a lot about everything, but can't do very much. So but if you need to know how to do nothing, contact me. I'm always ready to help.
I'm Gary Twining-Wright. As you know, Ian tried to get rid of me last week, but I came back with vengeance this week. I've been in the security industry for 37 years. I've done everything you can do in the security industry, from close protection, static guarding, to nightclub work, to infiltration, penetration, training, writing books, etc. The only thing I don't do is cyber security. Certainly isn't my bag. So what I'm going to do is hand over to Mr. Mike Kill, who's been our guest before, and he's going to introduce himself. Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you. I don't know if I could be as colourful as you two at this time in the evening, but yeah, my name is Mike Kill. I'm the Chief Executive for the Nighttime Industries Association. Been in the industry about 30 years. Similar to you guys, have pretty much done everything, give or take a few things that I've avoided, but yeah, I'm pretty well rounded in terms of, you know, from working at the bar to working at exec level, in different industries and different companies, but now obviously got a very front-facing political and industry sort of role that you know, I've privileged to have at the moment, if I'm going to be really honest with you. You know, and still working hard, even though it feels like the pandemic is behind us. It almost feels like it's still nipping at our heels in some respects, especially with some of the news that's come out today.
Well, before we go, what news has come out today, Mike? This show is really about you today, not about guest safety officers.
Right. Okay, so well, as probably some of you are aware, the reports that came out from the the committee scrutinising the behaviour of the former Prime Minister has come out with pretty damning evidence to suggest that he misled Parliament, and as you can appreciate, I mean, that has brought about some outrage from quarters of the sectors who were hardest hit, and if I'm going to be quite frank about it, you would expect the highest office of the country, who were the ones who administered and, you know, placed us in lockdown and put us in a position where they restricted everything we did in the interests of public health, to uphold those very same interests. But it's clear from some of the evidence today, and I'm sure the COVID inquiry will uncover even more information, that the situation was not quite as it seemed. And I think there is more culpability to come out in the future with different people within government as it stands at the moment. Although we've lost, you know, several of the, including the former Prime Minister and several MPs, I'm pretty much sure that we are going to see other people fall for this as well, which is concerning, because we need stability at this moment.
So how would that affect our industry, Mike?
Well, I mean, the challenge that we have at the moment is, you know, our industry is in a very compromised position. We talk about the security sector, the hospitality sector, nighttime economy. We're all, you know, really struggling. We're seeing, you know, cost inflation take our cost of operation up by about 40%. We're seeing customer visits or frequency, dwell time spend reduced by about 15–20%. And that impacts all the way down the chain, whether it be security supply against numbers coming through the door, the amount of nights that were operational. There, you know, midweek has really sort of died. Student sessions have slowed dramatically, and we're just moving into festival season, where I'm pretty sure that the high streets and festivals are going to sort of split the audience in many respects. I mean, there are some very successful festivals, but we're hearing of many of these festivals struggling to sell tickets, and That doesn't even take into account, whether we can staff them, and whether industrial action on top of that sporadically is going to start impacting on consumer mobility. So, for us, we've got a really tough sort of period ahead, moving through to the summer. Heat doesn't help unless you've got a garden or something like that. It's where the pubs and beer gardens really work. But if you're a club, that's a real challenge. And much of the focus now is, we're trying to get past the squabbling internally in terms of government at the moment and focus on the autumn budget, which is going to be the opportunity for me anyway, where the government can right a very bad, irreparable wrong as such in terms of the ways that they've managed themselves, and what we've heard today. So, the November 17th date, which is the day that the budget comes out, is their opportunity to allow many of the industry, whether it be a VAT cut or whatever it is, to actually give some financial headroom for many of these businesses to survive, because there is definitely many of them out there that are not thriving at the moment, particularly the independents and the cultural sector. And that obviously has a knock-on effect through all the supply chain, etc.
You've got anything to say on that, Ian?
Well, my views go back to the discussions that, and the articles and research I've been doing on the financial situation within the nighttime economy, and it's quite interesting, based on what Mike's just said, that in America they're actually experiencing a far worse recession, a far worse impact on the nighttime economy, and it sort of raised a question for me when I started looking at the legislation, because apparently California has been particularly hit, and in San Francisco, Proposition 47, which was brought in 2014, seems to have started off seems to be the start of progressive policies, well-intentioned, meant to help and to bring forward and to unify and promote inclusivity, have actually had the reverse effect, and are actually started to drive businesses and taxpaying revenue out of that area. Mike, do you see that potentially being, if we're too involved in politics as a nighttime economy, becoming an issue?
I think one of the things, funny enough to talk about California, but I was on a call with the California sort of Bar and Club Association, and they described a very similar thing. Their policies and their infiltration or engagement with, say the federal, but the state environment in terms of nighttime economy and licensed trade was very, very fraught. And what they were asking me was, how do they develop that relationship? How do they develop an infrastructure? And a lot of our strategy at the moment is the recognition that there was a period of driving for support, but also a period of driving to educate. So a lot of the work that we're doing at the moment is about education, is about representation, it's about infrastructure, it's about local and national communication strategy, and then it's also about working with immediate solutions. So looking today with the Home Office, talking about ways of deregulating and looking at planning and licensing easements in a way that we can remove barriers and encourage investment and growth. And we talked about things like soundscaping and the fact that we've got to transition from a feeling of isolating entertainment and cultural quarters and start to think about cohabitation, and what we do for those cohabitation moments. I was on a call with Tak Umezawa, who's the head of the Tokyo nighttime economy, who spoke very openly, Tokyo being probably one of the most highly populated cities in the world. And you call it a city, but I think it's even more than that. But the fact of the matter is they have had to transition from this thought process of siloing what goes on to actually cohabitation. And I think we really struggle with understanding that, alongside things like licensing departments and planning departments working within silo and not integrating, not having a framework and a not considering not only they talk about partnership and collaboration in terms of outward, but they don't actually represent it internally themselves. They work in silos. Planning sees itself as a very sort of educated position compared to licensing, which is seen as an under department or a lower department in terms of skill set, and the integration between the two is quite disparate. So what we really need is a national framework that's going to consider what's happening amongst those departments, communication benchmarks as we go through applications, so that we are not creating legacies of buildings that are built directly opposite cultural spaces with a 2 or 3 year cycle before we get to a point where people start making complaints. And then what we do is we have that struggle, and the mitigations on sound are not thought of from the offset because EHO, planning, licensing are not talking to each other. Every day that goes by without that framework and that scope in terms of communication and national sort of drive to ensure that there is an integration with strategies, whether you talk about cultural nighttime economy, is one more day where we've got to reset and go back to re-looking at some of those businesses that potentially would be compromised in the few years. And I mean, one of the questions I was asked today was, what's your view on it? How do you want to see the government sort of move forward? And I said, someone's got to be brave enough to go back to ground zero, look and recognize on what the strategy is moving forward, recognize where the deficit is, start from a minus position, get a reality in terms of where ground neutral is or the zero position, and then work towards it. But we're not going to do this as every day goes by. More planning is accepted because of residential. We build unmitigated buildings and cultural spaces suffer within 2 or 3 years. That's what we're doing repetitively at the moment. That's why solicitors, barristers are absolutely, so busy because they're just dealing with noise and nuisance. And if you think about it, noise and nuisance is subjective, at what point, if you do a soundscape, do you recognize the difference between people walking by and traffic and cultural noise, and what sort of mitigates those sound sort of dispersal and where they resonate from. So there's so much that I think we do so wrong at the moment, and I think we've got to start with grassroots, which is train the people appropriately, get planning and licensing and EHO working together, formulate a framework and a strategy and a communication strategy that works so everyone is in line and understands what's going on, and then create a data environment which is amalgamated so they come to one source and one opportunity to understand what's going on a regional basis. That's what we need to do to start resolving positions. That's when we're going to start safeguarding our industry, and with dereg and planning easements start to then see a real positive investment program and growth program, and people starting to be better or feel better or happier within inner city environments where that cohabitation strategy works in a more joined up approach. God, that was heavy.
It was a little bit heavy, but it's funny you should say that, because it's just one of the things which is, it seems the nighttime economy, a lot of venues are being driven out because of these new builds. I mean, I'm working for a couple of venues at the moment, and one of the major thing is again noise. They had an event recently on a what's it called, a Saturday afternoon, and their license basically is at 2200 or 10 p.m. They shut the music down, but the neighbours decided to come down at 9 p.m. 2100 hours. They're going, our windows are shaking. This is happening. We want you closed down. And now one of the clubs I'm working for or consulting for, they're now having a review because the neighbours are moaning about the noise. And they, these places have been there for a long time. I mean, we saw this happen in Camden. Where else did it happen? And also in back at Hackney, we used to have a place we used to have round by near Hackney Wick. It was a fantastic place. It was called the Arches, underground, under the Arches. Fantastic place. And they built all these big new tower blocks up and all the rest of all these new high-rise buildings. And the Arches is gone now because the residents shut it down because of the noise. That place had been there. We'd been there 10 years with them. Yeah. Just gone now.
Listen, we have, I mean, definitely post-pandemic, because of the quiet that people experience in residential spaces, it's definitely put more pressure on the sector as a whole. But I actually don't think there is a strong enough framework. And I'll give you an example. when you talk about licensing or mitigation, you know, any police officer you speak to is they've got no framework to work to. It's not like health and safety where you go, right, what's the hazard and what's the exposure? They literally, it's right, well, you know, this is point B, and that goes against the objective. There is no sort of measure or position in terms of a framework that's actually going to give a consistent decision, whether you're in Brighton or whether you're in Newcastle. So I think we've got some real challenges already, and it's down to local interpretation, and that's about personalities and subjective views, which I think creates some real ambiguity when it comes to decision making. So I think we've got some real challenges locally, but we've got to sort the foundations out before we can grow. And you know, if we don't start dealing with those foundation pieces, then we're going to continually face this legacy of issues and challenges. Because, you know, I mean, one of the things that we're doing at the moment is we're just talking about doing a training course with the College of Policing around industry and culture. And, you know, I keep bringing up this thing is if you're an FIA director, you know, looking at a Formula One race, you need to understand racing to be able to enforce against it or direct. The same way if you're a police officer, if you're looking at the industry and culture, you've got to understand it to be able to, you know, make a decision and an informed decision. And that comes down to experience, understanding, but also a level of data. And I think that two of those components, or three of them in some cases, are completely missing. Because what you do find is licensing officers in some respects, particularly in policing, sometimes you find that people are coming towards the end of their career and that's where they sort of settle, sadly. And, you know, that's not always the way, but it's definitely something that we've experienced at the moment. And they've got very fixed views on where things are. And, you know, we're working in an environment where music, fashion and people are fundamental to what goes on. You know, music doesn't stand still, it keeps evolving. And people need to understand that this constantly evolving culture is something we've got to manage, whether it be music, whether it be fashion, whether it be drug use or whatever it is. It's something that needs to be considered by everyone involved in that ecology. And I think I do think that the police are very rigid in the way that they approach it. They're not considered or understood.
I think you're right. The one thing I would just sort of take out of that is the evolving nature of the music industry. And gosh, I know some of you are thinking it's not possible, but I'm actually 66 in 2 months' time. And I'm retiring, yahoo. But the fact is I've loved music all my life. And all the things that you've just mentioned there, Mike, you know, drugs, drink, you know, rock and roll, music, loud, yeah, as loud as possible. That has been part of my life and part of society's life all the time. Isn't that what we all need to experience?
Of course it is, but I'll give you an example. I remember the days when you had to wear trousers, pair of shoes and a shirt to get in a club, right? Now they're turning you away with a bubble on your trainers. So the reality is you go from that example to, you know, if you go to an electronic music dance night, in the early days, it was a person DJing who invited 200 of their friends into a room to listen to music that they all loved, and they all patted each other on the back, great set and all that. Next thing you know, it was every month they put a guest DJ on. That was the big pinnacle event, etc. Then it became twice a month, then it became every week, then it became a lineup. Next thing you know, people aren't going out unless there's a big event going on.
Yeah.
So the reality is that's the evolution of our industry. That's what's happened. And you know, we've got to go with the changes. But I do think that while we try and keep up with it, we also need the authorities to have a greater understanding so that they're informed in terms of decision making. There's no point in sitting on the sidelines and just go, computer says no, computer says yes. Engage, get involved, understand, ingratiate yourself with what the industry is and how it's changing, and work with the industry to understand it as much as they're working towards it.
Is there just want to pick up just that last bit? Is getting the police to engage, and I get that, it's so important, but who is it really the role of a policeman to make the decision about whether something is right or wrong, or is that the role of the lawyers and the legal to have their little players. That's all. I have my personal view, but I don't know.
I think, I mean, this is why they have the stepped approach, isn't it? And obviously, if there's a clear violation of a licensing objective or a condition, and it's very clear cut and it's serious, and this is where it comes to the framework of risk, hazard, exposure, etc. They've got to quantify that, but there still is no framework for it. The reality is it really depends on the immediacy of the risk, and if you've got a queue or people are crushing, there's an immediacy of it. If there is an incident that can be spoken about separately, then that's the pragmatic approach. What we're finding is there is a huge inconsistency because of personalities on the ground. That says to me that the framework is not strong enough to withhold. I mean, we talk about national planning framework and agent of change. I mean, how many agent of change propositions have we seen out there that safeguard businesses? Because there isn't a stringent position undertaken to ensure that we've got that heritage protection scheme or that ability to stop these things from happening or the businesses being lost. We talk about deed of easement. You talk about all of these sort of things that are really good opportunities, but if you don't understand them or know them, you're pushing yourself along in sand trying to get some of these planning officers and licensing officers to consider that position. I mean, it's like access of community value. I mean, a lot of it is misinformation, if I'm going to be honest. Most of them don't really understand it. So you're challenging them in a way that is potentially about their training in many respects. And that's where the issue is. And I know the IOL are doing some work on planning and licensing, but I still maintain they need to understand the industry. They need to understand a cyclical version of what's going on culturally. There's a big difference between drill, grime, Afrobeat, and the connotations that surround it and the way that people act and the potential drugs and what they drink and how they hang out and the type of people that understand what's going on within the industry. Don't sit and, allow people to be exposed to unconscious bias and all of these things which really hinder culture. How many times when you look at data do we see within a license application the consideration for a quality impact assessment? Community, economy, culture, everything in terms of those 4 licensing objectives is about risk. They don't talk about, how important it is, where the community balance is, what they draw into the local area. And I understand safety is really important, but just get to a point where we've got to be balanced in our data provision, or otherwise what we're doing is we're just barking up a tree, which is all harm reduction and not about supporting culture. And it's very easy to just draw yourself down the line. And our problem is nighttime economy is almost, how many times people talk about it as counterculture. It's risk culture. You go to Berlin, it's celebrated culture, and that's the difference. We've got to start celebrating probably one of the biggest exports that we have. And 300 million nightlife tourists suggest that we're doing quite well at it. Not at the moment, clearly, but.
I tell you what, because I want to bring up something else in a minute, Mike. Just because it's great thing you bring up there. How would you summarise how we could change that if we just move on to the next subject, which I want to ask you about what we just put into play? How would you summarise that?
So I think one of the challenges that we have is the narrative that's presented, the way that we approach licensing, the way that we approach nighttime economy in terms of risk is a big issue. The only way that we can start to change it is by having a stronger network of representation up and down the country. That looks at things like nighttime economy advisors, that looks at getting counsellors with a broader age group spectrum represented on a local basis. I think the average age of counsellors, from what I understood several years ago, was about 65.
Not his age.
So, and that's not to suggest that some of them will have an understanding of nighttime economy, but it would be great to get a stronger, balanced age, ethnicity, gender mix that is going to give us a stronger representation on the ground and potentially start to move us towards having, bigger conversations about how nighttime economy can positively impact, social mobility, social cohesion, all of these really important things, shaping communities, mental, social, physical, and mental well-being sort of pieces, we tend to miss all the positives. We just focus on these negatives, and we've got to change the narrative one way or another. And the only way that we can do that is people on the ground, representation in local government and representation in national government. And the long-term plan is for us to get to a point where we're talking more, we've got a stronger data set that has a greater understanding geographically in terms of the locality, so that we can then start celebrating and representing in the right way, both regionally and nationally, on the importance of nighttime economy. But we need to get that infrastructure in place, because without it, we can't change, we can't have that positive change.
So at the end of the day, we need to get people in the right places, don't we, at the end of the day?
Exactly.
And change them. The next part I want to bring up with you, because this show is really all about you, Mike. Matins Law, you were in the Home Office the other day. And if you give us a brief rundown of how that went down.
Do you know what? I've done the Home Affairs Select Committee a number of times. It was nice even that the chair recognised me from the spiking committee meeting that we had. But listen, this is a hugely technical bill, and the challenge that we have, and myself as a representative, is that there are so many sort of nuances to the different types of businesses that are out there. So what I had to take is quite a pragmatic view with my approach, having about 15, 20 minutes in terms of opportunity to put across the right things. So I broke it down into about 8 or 9 sort of headers, which I can take you through, which kind of give you a broad feel of where the challenges lie for Matins Law moving forward. So one of the biggest things that everyone's worried about is not only proportionality, but cost. The financial impact assessment was suggesting that a small standard business over 10 years, it would cost about £2,000 to implement. And for an enhanced business, it would be about £80,000 to implement over the course of 10 years. And my view is it's grossly understated, being quite frank about it. I don't think it takes into account the high turnover of staff, the current financial burden, and also the other thing that I think is really important is the costs are going to be front loaded. You know, to get this up and going, you're going to have to train all your staff, get everyone in line, look at all your sort of supply chain in terms of getting them up to a standard. So I think the impact assessment is greatly understated. And I do think, without a doubt, there are many businesses out there that are hugely concerned that they are going to be financially buoyant following this implementation, given the cost position on it. And that's where we're sort of fighting in terms of NACSO and Protect UK to make sure that there is the right support at the most vulnerable level. So, and what we identify as a vulnerable level is the 799 or 100 to 799. There is a very basic delivery sort of piece. I think our challenging area is between 800 cap and 2000, particularly in things like clubs, etc. Because once you get to the higher capacities, then you start to see safety action groups kick in, and a lot of them have CT strategy, which is part of their sort of advisory, safety advisory group. That's a lot of their sort of provision and drive, and they have people who advocate for that on those groups anyway. I think the second one for me is language. We talk about it being open to interpretation. We talk about, we already see a lot of language within licensing that is misinterpreted or utilized at ground level in the right way. So language to me is a really, really important part here. And there are several examples, you know, things like vicinity and reasonable that draw people into a false sense of security because that's subjective. Consistency is the next one, ensuring that the bill is consistent with existing legislation, how that integrates or knits. And then over and above that is, where does it sit in terms of its primacy? Which one takes precedent? Does the Licensing Act take precedent? Where does planning sit in it? Where does the Matins Law come into it? At the moment, there just seems to be a disassociation between the two, and there's been no conversation about how they knit together. And we can talk about health and safety. We talk about the Private Security Act. But I think it's really, really important to really start to understand how they integrate. I think it's hugely concerning that we're walking into this over a very short term and still feeling that that work has already been done without scrutiny from the industry. So the other side of things are things like scope. So considerations for specific operational areas, i.e. if you're doing an event and you've got sites which are closed in during a phase of build, does that fall within scope? You know, where do these things sit? There's lots of inconsistencies and out of scope positions that need to be considered relevant to different business categories. Perimeter, I think, is an obvious one. If you've got a rolling London Marathon, Notting Hill Carnival, non-ticketed New Year's Eve event, travel hubs around, you know, events also, it very, very difficult in terms of the definition. And that also draws you into the argument about vicinity. You know, you talk about grey space, you talk about, you know, things like Wembley Way, O2 Walk Up, the Manchester Arena thing. We've got to be very, very clear in this bill or this legislation to ensure that we encompass everything. Vicinity can mean so many things outside. I mean, when you look at things like the Brixton Academy, what is the vicinity? You know, what you can see 1 mile up the road. So I think we've got to be very, very specific with what we talk about. I brought up primacy. And also, I mean, within that primacy is a clarity on who is the duty holder. When you have complex venues, is it the owner, the manager, the licensee? When it's several entities that are overlapping in terms of responsibilities, where does that sit? And that comes into this responsibility piece where, you know, who is responsible outside the fence line? There's one policing environment that will say you can't go outside your front door, but there'll be expectation by other policing environments that want you to step outside. And then they'll want you to make a risk assessment judgment on whether there is a risk to life. So I think there has just got to be consistency within that. Three more that I would say that are really important. We don't know who the regulator is. And without the regulator, we don't know what the approach will be, whether it be, you know, fire service, whether it be HSE, whether it be police. We'll all predetermine how that approach is and how we prepare for this. Reasonability, who is to judge what reasonable is? Who will be the arbiter? You know, particularly around things like temporary events. I mean, it's, you know, it's so loose, and this is where we come down to licensing again. You know, that personalities on the ground, the subjective nature of them predetermining what they believe is a big risk or a small risk is done on the ground. And it could be about just being bloody minded in some respects. And then the last thing I think is really quite important and quite an interesting one is the cooperation. If we look at coordination and cooperation where people are diverting responsibility, i.e. protests and demonstrations, pop-ups, environments where you're getting a large gathering of people where not one person is predetermined as a responsible person or a competent person, that then obviously opens up the scope in terms of exposure. And then the last thing that I think is really important is I don't think we're considering the impacts, particularly around private security and door security, on some of the shortcomings or voids in controls that we have around, and we talk about business licensing, and I couldn't help myself in the Home Affairs Select Committee to punch that one out at the end, which I'm sure Ian you heard, which was, you know, 3,000 to 4,000 security firms untraceable by HMRC, SIA, Home Office, and surely people have got to recognise that void in you know, counter-terror strategy, and to hear the business licensing has been kicked out recently is it's irresponsible. So for us, I mean, I hope that gives you a bit of a feel of some of the challenges that I feel that this bill has, not things that can't be worked through, but it really, really shows how little information or clarity is still missing from this bill and how they're going to move forward with it. So although there's a lot of conversation in the background, to go through a scrutiny process at such an early stage just seems almost like a waste of time.
Do you feel they're pushing this too quickly to go for? As I say, there's lots of gaps there. I'd like to go about business licensing because me and Ian were speaking about this the other day, and I have to say I was disappointed about the business license thing as well. Even though I was against it, I am disappointed by it. But as I say, there is lots and lots of holes in this Matins law or the Protect Act, whichever we're calling it, and it just seems to be that they're rapidly trying to push this through. And are they going to? Do you feel they're going to try and push this through? And we've got, as you say, there's so much that there could be misjudged or misinterpreted in certain ways.
I mean, that's obviously part of my job as a representative for the industry to really sort of advocate to ensure that we've got the detail before it gets to the point of being pushed through. But what I would probably say to you is, I mean, I've recently joined the CBTI group, which is NACSO, Protect UK and Home Office, where they're scrutinising the information, looking at competent person schemes and lots of different things like the thresholds for CTSA engagement. So at what point, at what threshold size capacity do counter-terror officers from the police get involved? Because they've got to consider, you know, how many of those officers are going to be available given the broader scope of businesses that are going to have to consider this. We've also got to consider the broader scope of expertise that's out there to be able to privately engage with many of these businesses, because some of them have understated available, access to the expertise. And, you know, you've got to be really honest about it. 3.2 million people in hospitality, taking even security out, to get training through on that level, unless they do it on a digitized basis. And bear in mind that we're not just talking about standard training. There has to be bespoke training for 800 cap and above. I think it's a tall order. I actually don't think they're going to get it in until the year after next, being reasonable. And I think the scrutiny, even given some of the things that we brought up today, I think it's going to be very hard to push through. And we are, without a doubt, going to be advocating to ensure that we tie down every single moment of this so that we're not going to be faced with the licensing challenges that we're faced with today. Either way, I think it's positive if it's done correctly and it is done effectively in terms of its terminology, interpretation, consistency, scope, primacy, response. All of those key sort of headlines have to be nailed down, or otherwise what we're doing is we're just a flag in the wind waiting for something else to go wrong because we've missed a moment.
I hear you. Have you got anything you want to sign that in?
Blimey, as you know, could all show on this. Just me, never mind anyone else. No, Mike, brilliant at the Home Office. What you said, laid it out perfectly. Ridiculous. 3,000 to 4,000 businesses, security businesses that won't fall or won't be licensed. And how you can then say that the Matins law is being properly supported by the Home Office is just a joke. As far as it's not. How can you do it? Because even if you think about that, even the new regulator, if it isn't the SIA, is still going to need all of that information.
Of course it is, and I mean, just to we've been working quite a lot with the SIA and HMRC, and HMRC are driving this Agencies Act now, and we've had 2 meetings, one with a group of security supply chain through the UK DSA, and then one with a group of operators, including some of the bigger operators. And when the HMRC have gone out and been very clear that as far as they're concerned, they expect everyone to be PAYE, and Agencies Act suggests that, the culpability goes up the chain. So if you cannot not express a very clear understanding of your due diligence in terms of, then there is a potential culpability in terms of the tax deficit. And I think what's becoming very clear to HMRC is the shortcoming in tax is growing in terms of their consideration around resourcing this challenge. And I think with that in mind, I think that's going to escalate HMRC's position and is going to potentially then inject or fuel business licensing one way or another. And we've got to be cautious with business licensing. There's no two ways about it. It's got to be done in the right way. It's got to be accessible as well. And, for me, there's a lot of work, that's another lot of work off the back of this. But what I'm understanding is ACS is looking at being rebranded. And the conversation that seems to be bowling around is they're looking at driving it along a voluntary gold standard scheme proposition, which I'm just not sure. Well, I am sure. I think the reality is it's not at the moment right or fit for purpose. We need to have a register or understanding of who is delivering private security out there purely from a counter-terror position. We need to know who's vetting, to what standard, and what's going on within the sector, so that we can communicate with people and be very clear and understand exactly what's going on. So that, the other thing is data. I mean, if you think about it, if you've got licensing, we can understand if we've got a shortcoming in workforce. And where hospitality and nighttime economy rely on it, or counter-terrorism relies on a number of security in terms of provision, then we can start to activate different things in terms of driving more people coming to the industry. But then that brings about this whole restructuring of badge system. Do we separate door security from man guarding? Are they two separate things? I mean, PCS in man guarding works because of corporate responsibility guidelines. If you're in Canary Wharf, man guarding makes sense. In door security, if you're got one bar and it's the dog and duck, ACS is, it's just another cost element to people, because it only stacks towards the cost of an hour per person working. So I think they've really got to think a little bit more pragmatically in terms of the way that they structure and move forward. And at the moment, I think door security is almost a secondary thought against man guarding. And there's some work that needs to be done to give it some sort of vocational prospect that are going to start elevating people and allow people to want to access and take an active part in the security sector, whether it's door security as a start role, and then they move to management, and then they look at CP and all the different things. But it's got to have this escalation in skill set, whether it be catastrophic first aid, welfare officer, pit training, whatever it is. It's almost like we've, it's like, for me, I don't know this sounds odd, it's like scout badges, isn't it? The more scout badges you have, the better the grade of security you are, the more prominent you are as a person working within the sector. But we can argue till we're blue in the face. Let's start with business licensing, and then we'll start debating the other bits if we can get it over the line.
I hear you there. I mean, so I just want to sum this up now. I mean, really looking at that, at the end of the day, the protect or Matins law needs to come more together on that. Am I right in saying that? And you're saying 100%. another year, hopefully another 2 years. We're looking at.
I think the scrutiny. I mean, there's another meeting on the 20th. You've got Matt Dukes, Tom Tugendhat that are in on the 20th. I think I'm going to try and get there to listen to that. But that's going to be an interesting one to see what their views are and what the committee asks them.
Are you going to be there?
Yeah, I'm already feeding questions through to the committee. Trust me, I'm not going to leave that to anyone else. I've already sent in about 10 questions to the chair to make sure that we get everything we can from that meeting, particularly from the minister.
So on that point, we're running out of time, and we could go on for ages. All three of us can go on for ages about bits and pieces. There's lots of points which, bringing up business license again and about training officers up to a better standard, security guards, DS, etc. I just want to finalise on these really points. Have you got anything you want to say on this, Ian, or finalise this?
My only thing is, as I've already said, business licensing got to come in, has to. Training has to improve, absolutely. And that is, without doubt. My only thing perhaps is that I would say is that Mike Gardner, MBE, on the same select committee, I thought he summed it up quite well, because he says basically people are just being asked to do what they're already supposed to be doing. And if we do that, what do we need? the protect duty to the extent that it is.
Yeah, the sad bit about it, and I'm going to be quite frank about it, is while the suggestion is that people are supposed to be doing it, there is quite a void between what we're expecting and what's actually happening.
Yeah.
And that provision, there is a void, without a doubt. There's no two ways about it. You know, I've experienced it on many occasions. I don't think counterterrorism in my term as an operator was a prominent position that was undertaken by larger companies or independents in any way, shape or form. It was about delivering experience and service predominantly. Safety was, because the sad bit about it, and I'll sum it up in this way, security is not a money generator. It's not an economic driver. So they can't comprehend the security, the value per hour of a security member against a member of staff who's going to turn over £1,000 in the night. They just can't. It's very difficult sometimes. Everyone will talk about safety, but the reality is that's, you know, it's a cash driver. And I know that's a harsh reality, but and at the moment in a challenging circumstance, it's more often than not the truth. But you know, we need to try and balance the books here, because I think they're having a, you know, both sides are very, very important to that leisure pound.
Well, thank you, Mike. I appreciate you coming on and explaining everything tonight. And on that note, I think we should call it a night. What do you think, gentlemen?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gary.
Thank you for turning up this week, Ian. Much appreciate that. Michael, as always, it's a pleasure to have you on the show, and we look forward to having you back again.
Yeah, anytime, guys. Really, really nice to spend some time with you this evening.
Thanks, appreciate that, Mike.